So it's great to see everybody. Thanks for being here. My name is Caitlin Parsons. I'm really excited to be here today. This is actually my first time attending an NIAC summit, and it's been really great so far getting to listen to the other speakers and connect with a few of you guys. So thanks again for being here to listen to me. So just a bit of background. I'm a behavioral science analyst at SCORE. And some of you have probably heard of SCORE. We're a global reinsurance company, and we strive to provide support and insights to our partners around the world. And as part of that work, my team, which is called the Behavioral Modeling Team, tries to investigate ways to use behavioral science insights to improve insurance products and processes for insurers and consumers. So today, I'm really excited to be here to share with you some of our work, and I'm going to be focusing on the results from some of my team's research on applying behavioral science to the design of life insurance application forms. So let's start with a few definitions. Behavioral science is the study of human decision-making, and it strives to explain how our decisions can be affected by psychological, cognitive, emotional, cultural, societal, all kinds of different factors. It combines insights from economics, psychology, and other fields to provide a holistic, nuanced understanding of how and why we think and act the way we do. And behavioral science involves a lot of different concepts, but two important ones are cognitive load and social norms. So cognitive load refers to the mental and emotional effort required to complete a task. It's basically how hard our brains have to work to get something done. Now, humans have limited cognitive availability, and that means that when a cognitive load of a certain task becomes too overwhelming, we'll try to employ strategies to reduce it. Now, often this involves using shortcuts that help us make quick decisions instead of having to think everything through really carefully. Now, that's good when it allows us to get through a task that would otherwise stop us in our tracks, but it can also lead to mistakes and errors in reasoning. A second important concept in behavioral science is social norms. So these are the expectations and traditions of our group or society. Humans are social creatures, and we like to fit in and be in line with the norm. And violating that norm can make us feel threatened or stigmatized. So that means that if a person is ever asked to admit to a behavior that they worry is outside of the social norm, they might not feel comfortable disclosing it. So behavioral science can be used throughout the insurance journey. For instance, when consumers are just starting to think about insurance, we can use behavioral science to investigate their understanding of it and learn more about what kinds of situations would trigger them to consider insurance. And then as consumers start to search for insurance policies, we can use behavioral science techniques to understand the trade-offs that they make. Which insurance features are really important to them, and how do they decide between different contracts? After a consumer becomes a policyholder, we can continue to engage with them throughout the life of their policy, using behavioral science principles to encourage healthy living habits and craft compelling communications. And finally, when a policyholder reaches the claim stage, we can use our understanding of behavioral science to create a straightforward claims process that is empathetic and works well for everyone involved. But we're actually not going to be talking about any of that today. We're going to be focusing on how we can use behavioral science techniques at the application stage of the process. There we go. So once a consumer has chosen an insurance policy, they're faced with the often daunting task of filling out underwriting forms to apply for coverage. And difficulties at this stage of the process can leave the applicant confused and frustrated, and it can also result in non-disclosure when the applicant gives incomplete or incorrect information on their application form. And this, of course, leads to incorrect pricing and eventual difficulties at the claims stage. But we believe that behavioral science can help. Our research focuses on how we can use behavioral science principles to redesign the application process to produce a better applicant experience and encourage more honest disclosure. So today I'm going to be walking you through a specific study that we conducted in that area. So before we get started, I do want to mention that this research was funded and overseen by the Society of Actuaries, who hired SCORE as the researcher. And then I also want to personally thank my amazing team at SCORE that worked on this project. It's really great to be here on their behalf today to present to you. So here's what we're going to cover. I'm going to take you first through an overview of the study that we conducted, the two separate parts of it. Then we'll briefly discuss the first part, which was a survey of the insurance industry. Then we'll talk through the design of the second part, which was an experiment. And then we'll run through some of the main results from that experiment. So, as I mentioned, our study consisted of two parts. First of all, we wanted to understand how the insurance industry, both in the US and globally, views behavioral science and its place in insurance. So in October 2023, we conducted a survey of professionals in the life insurance space to find out about their opinions and the use of behavioral science in their work. And then we really wanted to quantify the potential of behavioral science in one area of life insurance in particular, which was the design of the application process. So we created an online experiment to test the effect on disclosures of using behavioral science principles to redesign the application form presented to applicants. So to begin with, we wanted to have a good understanding of the state of the insurance industry in terms of behavioral science. We wanted to know, is this a topic that's of interest to insurance companies? What interests them about it, and what kinds of things are holding them back from exploring it further? So to answer these questions, we're going to start by looking briefly at some of the results from our industry survey. So the first thing we wanted to know was just, does your organization use behavioral science? And globally, around 35% of organizations were using it in life insurance products and processes. A significantly higher proportion of respondents in the US said that their organization used behavioral science compared to the rest of the world, so we're actually a bit ahead of everyone else. Of the 30 organizations using behavioral science, over 83% used it on at least a third of their projects and processes. And the top 3 departments that used it were underwriting, data analytics, and marketing. And reinsurance organizations were especially likely to be using it in underwriting, which was not very surprising to us because we are a reinsurance organization that is using it. So, respondents were then asked in which areas their organization engaged with behavioral science and when. And since today we're talking about using behavioral science to review the wording of underwriting forms, I'm just going to focus on those results. So 13 organizations had engaged with it on reviewing wording on underwriting forms in the past. 21 were currently using it in October 2023, and 14 were planning to engage with it in the next 12 months. Including 4 that were planning to introduce behavioral science into their organization for the very first time. This was actually the area, reviewing wording on underwriting forms, where we saw the most organizations planning to start using behavioral science. And when respondents were asked in which areas they'd like to learn more about behavioral science, this again was a big area. Over 35% chose reviewing wording on underwriting forms. So this is clearly an area where there's a lot of momentum and interest. And so then respondents were asked how useful their organization viewed behavioral science to be. 60% of respondents stated they viewed it to be at least somewhat useful. And then they were asked to select what benefits they feel their organization gets from using behavioral science. And the results here were generally positive. Every answer that we offered as a choice was chosen at least 30% of the time. The top 2 benefits selected were better understanding of policyholder behavior risk and enhancing customer experience. And over half of all organizations viewed those as benefits of behavioral science. Other benefits chosen included improving understanding of potential customers, producing more satisfied customers, and increasing customer loyalty. So the takeaway from this is that organizations are interested in using behavioral science and they think it could be beneficial. But of course, that doesn't mean that there aren't challenges to implementing it in underwriting. So we also asked them to choose what their organization viewed to be the greatest challenge of implementing behavioral science. And the top 3 responses were not enough expertise, not enough concrete results, and concerns about meeting regulatory standards. So this fits perfectly with the aims of our study. First of all, we're striving to provide expertise on how to use behavioral science to redesign the application process. Our research focuses on outlining several techniques that could be applied to a range of different application questions, and we also offer advice on how to evaluate and improve underwriting forms. Second, we offer quantitative evidence of the effect of this redesign. So as we'll see in a second, our experiment provides concrete results showing the effect of behavioral science techniques on disclosure. And finally, which I know is something that will be very important to this group here, we wanted to put companies at ease when it comes to regulatory concerns. So we know that testing new question wordings in the real world can often be a complicated process. And so we used an experimental setting to validate the use of behavioral science techniques so we can be more confident of their effects before we think about trying to implement them in a real-world application. So after we gathered some information about the state of behavioral science in the industry, we wanted to apply our knowledge to the design of the life insurance application process. And that leads to our behavioral science experiment. So we'll go through now the design of the experiment and then move into the main results. Traditionally, life insurance application forms have been designed from the perspective of the underwriter. So as underwriters, we just think about what information we need to underwrite the risk, and we design questions to collect that information in a way that makes sense to us. But obviously, there's another person involved in the process, and that's the applicant, and they often have a different perspective. They might be pressed for time, confused or frustrated by a complicated process, or put off by having to answer personal questions. They might end up non-disclosing, not because they want to be dishonest, but because the process doesn't make it easy for them to be honest. This is becoming increasingly important now as more and more companies are switching to accelerated application processes, where the applicant might be able to complete the entire application on their own online. And this means that the only information that we get to underwrite the risk might be from the application form. So it's really important that we get the right information the first and often the only time that we ask. This ensures we have a valid contract, which of course is really important for both the insurance company and for the policyholder, so that we're able to pay out benefits when they make a claim. So the idea behind this research was to look at changing the focus to the applicant perspective. That way we can design questions in lines with how the applicant would think about the information. And behavioral science principles can help us understand the customer perspective and design a customer-centric application form to ultimately increase disclosures and ensure a valid contract for both parties. So the main idea behind this research was to test that effect, to see when we use behavioral science principles to redesign application questions, are we able to get more disclosure? So to test this, we designed an online survey where participants were asked to answer questions off a sample life insurance application form. They were randomly assigned to be presented with either a traditional life insurance form or one we had redesigned using behavioral science principles. We can then measure the disclosures from each group of participants and compare them to see the effect of the redesign. So our experiment involved over 4,000 participants, which were split into 5 groups. We wanted our sample to be as close as possible to being representative of the insurance target market, so we did control for things like age, gender, and education level to balance those across the groups and make sure they were representative. But as I mentioned, assignment to each group was random. So participants in the control group were presented with a traditional life insurance application form, one that mirrored the wording and format that you'd find in a typical form currently in use in the real-world market. And then those in the next two groups received one of two different behaviorally redesigned forms, questionnaire A or questionnaire B, and each of these incorporated a different set of behavioral science principles. And then finally, we wanted to test the effect of an honesty pledge. So these are the short statements that are often included in an application where the applicant has to sign to promise that their answers are true and complete. Now, unfortunately, honesty pledges are often buried at the end of the application or in the middle of terms and conditions, or they might contain a lot of legal jargon, and all of that can just limit their effectiveness. But we did think that they had potential for increasing disclosure. So we tested the effect of incorporating a behaviorally redesigned honesty pledge. So our final two groups use the same application form as questionnaire B, but they add an honesty pledge at either the beginning or the end of the form. So here you can see the honesty pledge that we used. Now this was designed for our survey, so it's not exactly the wording that you'd want in an insurance form, but it does incorporate multiple behavioral science principles that you could use in a real form. So we have the idea of solidarity. Your answers will be used to benefit others, so we need you to be honest. We also build trust with the participant by promising to keep their information confidential. We point out that most other participants are honest, and we mention the consequences of dishonesty. And finally, we require the participant to actively engage with the pledge by typing out their name. So depending on your group, as I said, you either didn't see this pledge at all, or you saw it at the beginning before you answered any questions, or at the end after you had answered the questions. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to be focusing too much on the results from our honesty pledge groups today, but I will just give you a brief preview of them. Basically, we found that having an honesty pledge at the beginning of the form did seem to help increase disclosure on some questions. For instance, including an honesty pledge increased disclosure of mental health conditions. And we never saw an instance of the honesty pledge negatively impacting disclosure. So given that, our overall conclusion was that a well-designed honesty pledge could be a low-risk, high-potential technique to boost disclosure on some questions. But it's important to note here that this result only holds if the honesty pledge is placed at the beginning of the application, before the applicant moves on to answer any questions. We found that having a pledge at the end of the form had no effect on disclosure because almost no one went back after viewing the pledge to change any of their answers. It seems like by the time participants saw the pledge at the end of the form, it was just too late to affect their disclosures. But having a pledge at the beginning did help to introduce the importance of honesty at the start and put applicants in the correct frame of mind going into the rest of the form. So to make sure that everything was fair between the groups, each of our forms asked about the same things, just in different ways. And these are the questions we included in our survey. So these are fairly representative of the main, most important topics that come up in a usual life insurance application form. And today we're going to cover a selection of the results from some of these questions, and we'll focus on those topics of cognitive overload and social norms. So remember, cognitive load is how hard our brain has to work to complete a task. Since we have limited cognitive availability, we sometimes take shortcuts and make mistakes when we're faced with cognitive overload. As you can probably imagine, an insurance application requires a lot of cognitive power to get through, and it's really easy for an applicant to become overwhelmed. And when they do, the ways that they cope with that cognitive overload can lead to non-disclosure. So we're going to look at a few different ways to improve the design of application questions to reduce cognitive load and therefore promote more honest disclosure. So we'll start by looking at one of the techniques we tested with the medical conditions questions, and this is a technique we call Ask Again. So we all know how a typical application form asks about medical conditions, right? We're usually presented in a series of long lists grouped by body system. So you can see here in the control version of this question, we have conditions involving the endocrine system, conditions related to cancer, and then conditions involving the cardiovascular system. And each one of these lists has an overall yes/no answer that you need to provide. But within these long lists of medical conditions, there are usually some that are more important than others for the insurance company to know about, because they might have a big impact on your risk level if you've had them. So this could be things like diabetes, cancer, and heart disease. But of course, you can see here that it's really easy for those very important conditions to get buried in the long lists of other medical conditions. And this makes it harder for an applicant to immediately recognize them, and it requires the applicant to use more brain power to search for them. So these long lists can lead to cognitive overload. It's just too much information for people to process, and it can become overwhelming and frustrating. And as I mentioned, when people encounter cognitive overload, they often resort to shortcuts to help them get through it. And in this case, a common shortcut we see applicants using is skimming, where the applicant doesn't read each list very carefully and just checks node all of them without thinking. Now, a possible solution here would be to only ask about the really important conditions, but even though there are a few really important conditions in those lists, every condition in the list is important in some way, right? So we really don't want to completely forego asking about any of them because we might miss out on information that we need. So we had to think about how to overcome cognitive overload without eliminating questions. And basically, we wanted to give applicants a reason to slow down. So this was our solution, which we tested in questionnaire B, with 3 important conditions: diabetes, cancer, and heart disease. And the way the system works is that participants still go through the normal long list of medical conditions, including the 3 we really care about. So they're asked about endocrine conditions, and diabetes is in that list. And if they say no to that list, then later, after they've gone through all the medical questions, they are just asked to confirm what they said. So, you said you don't have diabetes. Is this correct? If the participant says no, that's incorrect, we have extra disclosure. And we can then compare the disclosure we got the first time we asked with how much extra disclosure we got from asking about it the second time. So here you can see for each of the conditions the additional disclosure. The darker portion of each bar is those who disclosed the first time they were asked. The lighter top part of the bar is the additional disclosure from the second "are you sure" question. And you can see we did in fact get a good amount of extra disclosure on all 3 conditions, around 50 to 120%, depending on the condition. In fact, for heart disease, we actually saw more people disclosing the second time they were asked than disclosed the first round. So this seems to indicate that our technique of giving applicants a chance to slow down and only focus on a few important conditions did help people remember conditions that they should have disclosed. Of course, you can't re-ask about every condition, but this could be a good way to improve disclosure on a few really important conditions, especially since it only adds 1 extra question to the overall form. Companies could also tailor re-ask questions to focus on the conditions that matter most to them. That might be conditions that they think are really important from a risk perspective, or those that they know have historically been under-disclosed. And this technique is a good example of a kind of surprising finding in behavioral science research like this. Sometimes adding friction to a process can result in better disclosure. So often when we think about trying to make a process easier, we only think about trying to make it faster or simpler. And that's usually a good principle to follow. But these results show that adding in a carefully crafted moment of reflection can actually improve outcomes. Slowing people down gives them time to overcome cognitive overload and consider their answers more carefully. Now, in addition to being overwhelmed by long lists of conditions, applicants also often experience cognitive overload when they're confused by how to answer a certain question. Sometimes this happens because the answer options offered don't match the experience of all applicants. So, for instance, this is the control version of the weight change question. So the participant encountered this after they reported that their weight changed in the past year. And this question then asked them to specify if the weight change was a gain or a loss. Now, the issue with this binary choice is that a lot of people find that their weight actually goes up and down throughout the year. So if you gained 10 pounds at the start of the year, and then you lost 8 pounds during the summer, and then you gain 11 pounds at the holidays, how would you answer this question? Right? It's hard. When an applicant encounters a question like this that doesn't have an answer option that matches their experience, it can leave them confused, frustrated, and unsure how to answer. And this could lead to choosing the wrong answer, trying to skip the question, or just dropping out of the process entirely. So to address this, we implemented the technique of expanding options. In questionnaire B, we offered a third option besides a loss or gain. My weight went up and down. If a participant selected this option, we then asked them to indicate what their maximum and minimum weight had been throughout the past year, and this allowed us to still calculate their total weight change. So here you can see the percentage of participants in each group that selected each option. So as you can see, around 24% of participants selected my weight went up and down when it was offered. In addition, the proportions of participants in questionnaire B who selected weight gain and weight loss were about the same as in the control group, which means that those who selected my weight went up and down in questionnaire B would probably have just said no weight change in the control group. That means offering this third option more accurately captured the experience of a significant set of participants. So you can see a similar situation in the alcohol question. This is the control version, so it asks about alcohol consumption, but it requires the participant to report their use in per week terms. But some applicants may not think about their consumption in that way. For instance, if someone only drinks on special occasions, they might think, well, I do drink a lot some days, but on a typical week, I don't really drink at all. So they might report 0 drinks per week, which of course is not really accurately capturing their experience. So in both QA and QB, we expanded the options by offering different frequency choices. So now a participant could report their consumption in terms of per day, per weekend, per month, or even less frequently. And this allows for a wide range of participant experiences when it comes to alcohol consumption. Just about everyone should be able to find an option that fits how they think about their use. So this is the percentage of participants that chose each frequency option. Across both groups, over 50% of participants chose options other than per week when they were offered. And this shows that the per week option doesn't fully capture the experience of most participants. So in both of these examples, we can see how the traditional answer options could alienate a lot of applicants and lead to feelings of confusion and frustration. And this, in turn, leads to cognitive overload, as applicants have to spend valuable brain power trying to decide how to interpret the question and second-guessing how they should answer. Offering expanded answer options doesn't really create much extra work from an underwriting perspective. With clear rules, for instance, it should be fairly easy to automatically convert per day alcohol consumption to per week terms. But having these additional answer options can make a big difference in the applicant experience and make it easier for applicants to know how to answer honestly. And this goes back to that idea that most applicants want to be honest, but they need our help to make the process easier. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, in addition to dealing with cognitive overload, applicants are also influenced by social norms. So, humans are very good at spotting what the normal expected behavior is in a given situation, and whenever possible, we want to stay within that norm. This means we're very sensitive to any perceived social stigmas, and will avoid exposing ourselves to that stigma as much as we can. We can see this show up in the mental health question. So this is the traditionally worded question that those in our control group received. There's a long list of mental health conditions with one yes/no response required for the entire list. So if you've ever had any of those conditions, you're supposed to say yes to the entire list. Now, there are obviously some potential problems with this approach. Mental health can be a really socially stigmatized issue, especially with certain mental health conditions. So this means if you have a condition like anxiety or depression, which are relatively more accepted and less socially stigmatized, you may not want to say yes to that overall list that also includes much more stigmatized conditions like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. You might think, I don't belong in the same box as people with those conditions. And so you might say no to the overall list to avoid being lumped in with conditions that don't apply to you. So one possible solution to this is to make it easier for applicants to only admit to the conditions that do apply to them. So questionnaire A was redesigned to address this. Instead of having the overall list, we just went directly to having separate checkboxes for each condition. So if you've had anxiety, you only need to check anxiety. If you've had depression, you just check depression. And of course, if you've never had a mental health condition, you can still just check none. But this makes it easy for an applicant to only admit to the conditions that they have, rather than having to say yes to that long list. And here are the results. So this is the percentage of participants in each group that disclosed a mental health condition. So in the control group, it's about 36%, but we saw a big jump up in questionnaire A. So around 52% of respondents in that group disclosed a mental health condition. That's a statistically significant 46% increase compared to the control. So it seems like that technique of separating out that list of mental health conditions and allowing the applicant to admit to only what applies to them was effective in helping applicants feel more comfortable disclosing their mental health issues. And our understanding of why this technique was effective also seemed to be confirmed by the results. We saw the biggest increase in questionnaire A of disclosure of relatively socially accepted conditions like stress. This seems to indicate that participants with those conditions would have failed to disclose them in the control group because they would have been put off by having to associate themselves with all the other conditions listed in the overall question. We also found that this technique could be effective in areas beyond mental health, in questions like about tobacco use or substance use. For instance, when we separated out different lists of tobacco products instead of asking about them all at once, we saw an increase in disclosures of e-cigarette use. E-cigarettes are often viewed differently from other tobacco products. They might be seen as healthier, as a step on the path to quitting, or as not really smoking. And if an e-cigarette user does view their use in that way, they may not want to say yes to a longer list of other tobacco products. So separating out the lists lets them only admit to e-cigarette use, which leads to more honest disclosure. So overall, this really simple technique of separating out longer lists and allowing participants to only admit to what's relevant to them was really effective in reducing feelings of social stigma and increasing disclosure. Now, when we use the technique of asking one thing at a time, we're acknowledging and working within the social norms that already exist. Mental health conditions carry different levels of social stigma in our society. We recognize that, and we design a question to take that into account. But we can also use our understanding of social norms more proactively. We can actually work to ensure that the social norms our applicants encounter reduce feelings of social stigma and encourage honest disclosure. We can see this idea in a technique that we tested with tobacco, which we call assume the behavior exists. So this is the standard question wording that our control group saw. It's just, have you ever used tobacco? And this question provides no clear social norm. It doesn't tell the applicant whether it would be normal or not for them to have used tobacco products. But given the context of an insurance application, where the applicant probably knows that the insurance company might have a problem with tobacco use, they may assume that the social norm here, the accepted behavior, is to not use tobacco. And if applicants make that assumption, then they may not disclose their tobacco usage because they want to stay within the social norm. So here you can see the redesigned question from questionnaire A. Here we're using the technique of assuming the behavior exists to create a new social norm. Instead of just asking, have you ever used tobacco, this question just assumes that you have, and then goes directly to asking what kinds of tobacco products you've used. Now, of course, you can still say, I've never used these products, but the framing of the question implies that the expected normal behavior is for you to have used tobacco. And now, instead of worrying that their usage will put them outside of the social norm, applicants can be put at ease by the knowledge that they're not admitting to anything out of the ordinary. So that might help them be more comfortable disclosing their true use. And here you can see the results of that change. This is the percentage of respondents in each group that disclosed current tobacco usage. You can see it's about 28% in the control group, but it goes up to 33% in questionnaire A, which is a 21% increase in disclosure. And these results show that using the technique of assuming the behavior exists was effective in creating a new social norm and putting applicants more at ease with disclosure. Again, it's similar to the ask one thing at a time technique with mental health. This is a really simple change of wording, but it has a big impact on the way that applicants encounter the question and how honest they feel comfortable being. So this just again shows the potential of behavioral science concepts like social norms to help us redesign questions that improve the applicant experience and promote more honest disclosure. So as you can see from this whirlwind tour of our results, we learned a lot from this study. Unsurprisingly, we found that cognitive overload has a big impact on the applicant experience. Long lists can lead to exhaustion and skimming, and increase the chances that applicants miss important conditions. Inadequate answer choices that don't fully capture the experiences of all applicants can also lead to cognitive overload as applicants become confused and frustrated and struggle to know how to answer. Fortunately, our study showed that asking a confirmation question about important conditions and expanding the answer options offered can both provide a smoother experience for applicants and more honest disclosure for underwriters. We also investigated the impact of social norms on the application process and found that lumping together conditions of varying severity and social stigma could alienate applicants and tempt them to answer no to questions where only one part applies to them. Letting applicants only admit to the conditions that are relevant to them significantly improved disclosure on questions like mental health. And finally, we saw how we could use our understanding of social norms to change the norms that applicants encounter and reassure them that their condition or lifestyle is normal and therefore safe to disclose. So I think the biggest takeaway here is that behavioral science principles do in fact work to improve disclosure rates in life insurance applications, sometimes by as much as over 100%. And this is really encouraging because it means that we can use these tools to improve the experience for applicants, ensure a valid contract, and make sure that we're able to pay out benefits when they're most needed. So now I just want to wrap up by advertising that the full results from this study are available online, so you can scan this QR code to access them. If you're looking for some light bedtime reading, we do have a 75-page report on all of our findings, as well as an interactive dashboard that will let you dive into the results for specific subgroups. So our team is always looking for new partners to work with as we continue to expand and apply our understanding of behavioral science. So the next steps of this research will be to partner with an insurance company to test out these techniques in a real-world application process. So if you're interested in working with us or in learning more about behavioral science, please do reach out to us. We'd love to discuss ways that we can work together. So thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to any questions. Yes.
Do you ever have implication on a consumer from the standpoint that they feel like they have a more personalized rate versus just whether or not they respond to the
Yeah, it's a very good question. So because this was, so two things. First of all, because this was an experimental approach, we didn't actually give anyone like a rate afterwards, right? It was more about seeing what were the answers, what was the disclosure, that kind of thing. So we didn't get direct feedback about that. But we did ask qualitative feedback questions at the end of the survey. Things like, did you feel like the survey or the application form took a long time? You know, like, did you feel like the experience was easy to get through? Were the questions hard to understand? Those kinds of things. Pretty much what we found, we had pretty low response rates on that qualitative feedback. I'm sure a lot of you may have encountered that issue before. But pretty much what we saw is that there wasn't too much of a difference between the control group and our other groups when it came to the feel of the application. At least in our study, we didn't see that. So that's encouraging in one way because it means that, you know, any of these things that we're doing that actually do make the application a bit longer than the control form, they're not making people feel like they're longer. People feel like they're still moving through the application at a good rate, probably because the questions are actually easier to get through. But of course, we also didn't see like a major improvement in applicant experience from our study. Now, we have heard anecdotally from like our partner companies that have worked at implementing some of these techniques in their actual application process, that they have seen more positive applicant experience and have gotten good feedback about these things. But yeah, not anything that we could quantify. So, anyone else?
Thank you, Caitlin, for the presentation.
Yeah.
And thanks for bringing this topic to a predominantly regulatory community. We appreciate it.
Absolutely.
One item I was thinking of, so it seems like this application of behavioral science to getting more honesty out of an insurance application, it seems relatively straightforward and basically uncontroversial and likely not to attract any regulatory scrutiny or anything like that. I noticed in your correspondence with the companies and their experience with behavioral science, there were some regulatory concerns.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any additional information about what maybe some of those concerns were from the company perspective about adding this into their processes?
Yeah. So, and maybe this is something where like it would be great to have maybe more communication between regulation and the industry about, are these kinds of techniques acceptable? Are they things that are going to cause more regulatory scrutiny? Because I think a lot of the companies that we talk to are a bit afraid of these techniques. They're a bit afraid that if they start trying to radically change their application approaches, that they're going to run into problems at the filing stage and run into a lot of questions about, well, why are you trying to change these questions? I think a lot of companies worry that they're going to be seen as trying to manipulate consumers into just getting more disclosure, regardless of whether that disclosure is accurate or relevant. Obviously, we take that concern really seriously, so we try to be really thinking through the ethics of all of the techniques that we're proposing. We want to make sure that we are not manipulating consumers in any way. One kind of practical way that we do that is to think about, like, do these techniques rely on tricking the consumer at all? In other words, like, if we were to tell the consumer that, we're using this technique, if we were to explain the technique to them, would it still work? And we think that the techniques that we propose would pass that test, because, like, for instance, with the confirmation question, if we were to say, we're asking you about this again to make sure that you didn't forget anything, that would still help people remember to disclose conditions that they might have forgotten. So we do take those concerns really seriously, and we do, when we're having discussions with our partner companies, try to reassure them that actually there are ways to use these techniques in a really ethical way, in a way that is actually aligned with the interest of the applicant, because the applicant wants to be honest, they want to have a valid contract, they want everything to work smoothly, and so we try to reassure them that, we're not going to have any issues with regulation because of that. But yeah, it would definitely be something that would be great to get the message out a bit further. Yep.
Sorry, last question, then
Yeah, of
I'll
course.
let everybody go. Did you ever test this with an agent or an advisor kind of reading off the question rather than having the consumer themselves do that,
Yep.
knowing how most of the applications get filled out?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and it is one of the kind of future research directions that we're looking at taking this in. We did not, so for this study it was focused on like a direct consumer kind of application. The reason being that, of course, it's much easier to test these kind of techniques when you're directly reaching the consumer. But of course, like you're pointing out there, that is a complication that occurs a lot in the real world, where like we can put all of the fancy wording that we want into these applications, and one of my team members always has the example of, well, if you get an advisor who just looks at the application and goes, so you don't smoke, right? Like that that just ruins everything that we've done. There's no point in it at that point. So we definitely are thinking through that complication. I think it goes to a lot of maybe agent education and kind of showing them these are why we're building these questions in this way. This is why it's important to ask the questions as they're written. And also just really bringing them into that process and saying like, well, what questions are not working for you? And what ways can we design it to make more sense for what you need? It's kind of adding in even a third perspective on top of the underwriter and the applicant. So that's definitely a future research direction that we're looking at. But yeah, so this research was just direct to consumer. Yep. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thanks. There are some issues that I can see with regards to, I mean, there is a way to amend the question, but the step one from filling out an application for life insurance is to capture the risk and also answer the questions to the best of your knowledge and belief. Just because you omitted to disclose something, it could affect your claim. Just because you did not understand the question could affect your claim. And the goal obviously is not to seek for a lower premium product. Rather, it's an actuarially justified product you're applying for. So it is for your best interest to fill out the question. Now, if the company chooses not to underwrite certain risk, they can, but if it does affect the risk, ultimately it does affect the result. So the concern I have here is how, look, there's nothing wrong with rephrasing the question as long as there is a form filed and approved to capture that. But like disclosures, there are some measures in a contract like contestability provisions that, you know, protects the company. There's fraud. Obviously, there are things in a contract from the regulatory standpoint. But it's really, really interesting. But there are some ways of going about it as far as, you know, at least from the regulatory standpoint. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that we like I said, we like to see this as kind of aligning the application, kind of acknowledging the fact that our goals are aligned with the applicant's goals. We want honest and accurate disclosure so that we can accurately price the risk. They want honest and accurate disclosure so that they can have a valid contract and not have to deal with any headaches down the line. So it's kind of that way of saying, like, is there a way that we can almost work together with the applicant to smooth this process for everyone? So, and I think regulators can definitely play a part in that, in helping us to make sure that we are always keeping that kind of ethical, protecting the consumer side of things in mind, which is really important. Thank you. All right, well, in that case, I think I will wrap everything up. Thank you guys again so much for your attention, and look forward to talking any more later. Thanks.